Good evening, Fellowship family, and welcome to a very special live edition of CBF Gathering tonight. I'm your host for the evening, Stephen Reeves, and I serve as Director of Advocacy for the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, as well as Executive Director of Fellowship Southwest. Tonight, we're celebrating the launch of a new and improved CBF Monthly Book Club. And tonight, we're happy to be joined by Robert P. Jones, the author of our first book for June. And we look forward to the conversation with him. But before I introduce Robert, I want to let you know that you can join in the conversation by entering questions in the comment section on Facebook. And we're going to try and get to a few of the questions before the evening is over. I also want to let you know that you have an opportunity to win a copy of Robert's book. If you'd like to enter to win a copy, we ask that you share this live event on Facebook on your page and tag the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. We'll randomly select winners from those who share to receive a free book. So please go ahead and do that now. I'd like to start this evening with a word of prayer before we get to our conversation with Robert P. Jones. Gracious God, we come to you tonight, as every day, in need of your grace and mercy. We give you thanks for your Son, Jesus, who came to bring good news and to free the oppressed. We're grateful tonight for sisters and brothers working to bring just a little more of your kingdom here to earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day the wisdom, courage, and perseverance we need to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Tonight we're really excited to have Robert P. Jones with us. He is the author of two books: The End of White Christian America, which is an award-winning book from 2017, and this book, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. Robert is the CEO and founder of Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI. He's got a mathematics degree from Mississippi College, an MDiv from Southwestern in Fort Worth, and a PhD from Emory. Robert, thank you so much for joining us here tonight.
Well, thanks, Stephen. I'm really glad to be here with you all.
Well, you know, when I was doing research on your bio, I saw that mathematics degree and I said, this fits. If you don't know PRRI, it's a very research-driven institution. And so to have someone like you with a combined skill set of theology and math is pretty unique. And we're grateful for your calling in that way. So thank you for what you do. And thanks for being here with us tonight.
Well, thanks.
For folks that don't know, White Too Long came out last summer and hit at a very critical time in the history of this country, dealing with the intersection of faith and racism and white Christianity in particular. These are not easy subjects, Robert, even as timely as they are. So what led you to write this book in the first place, and why should maybe CBF churches and pastors in particular take the time to read your book this month as part of our book club?
Yeah, well, this book is honestly the book I just needed to write for myself, to get clarity myself about some of the issues I've been wrestling with. As you said, I wrote this book called The End of White Christian America in 2016, and that was really a demographic book that talked about demographic and religious changes in the country, that we were moving from a majority white Christian country to one that was no longer majority white and Christian, and how that was setting off so many kind of reactions in our politics. And that book kind of opened the door, I think. And as that book was coming out, we also had the killing of Trayvon Martin and the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2015. Going into 2016, we had the election of the former president, Donald Trump, in 2016 as well, that kind of put race issues right on the front burner. And I think it was that kind of combination of things, and I think particularly for me is, I think, seeing kind of some of the kind of heartbreaking reactions by white Christian churches to the Black Lives Matter movement in 2015. Even even I live in Maryland, and it's a fairly progressive area of the country. And even in Silver Spring, Maryland, I was seeing Black Lives Matter signs being defaced, stolen from what they were being put up by white Christian churches at the time. So I think this kind of knee-jerk defensive reaction of kind of all lives matter, and this kind of reassertion of kind of white interest in the middle of these tragedies, it was kind of heartbreaking to me, and I realized that I really hadn't delved that deeply myself into my own faith. So it was really about kind of my wrestling my own faith to the ground around racial justice issues that led me to kind of embark on writing this book.
Well, in your book, you bring some of your personal story there of growing up primarily in Jackson, Mississippi, and then spending time in Texas and Georgia. I think a lot of our folks in CBF Life relate to where you grew up and how you grew up, for sure. But this book also has some history in it, some historical survey. Here we are tonight, where yesterday we just commemorated the 100th anniversary of the race massacre in Tulsa. And for a lot of folks, either just now or very recently, they are only learning this history. It's something that has been kind of pushed to the side or forgotten or intentionally kind of repressed. And so I'm wondering, as you did this research for the book and some of the stories that you found and told, what was maybe most surprising, something you didn't expect, or something you found particularly shocking?
Yeah, well, the historical record, I think, again, so I grew up Southern Baptist. I grew up, in the deep, deep South, mostly right along Interstate 20, Atlanta, and Macon, just south of there, Jackson, Fort Worth. That's pretty much where I was until I was well into my 20s. And my family has roots going back 6 generations in Middle Georgia, in and around Macon, Georgia. So, these are kind of my people. And so I realized, though, that I knew virtually nothing about, I'd never been taught the kind of racial history of our denomination. It wasn't until I was in seminary that I learned that, my early 20s, that I learned that the genesis story of our own denomination, that in 1845, the reason why the Southern Baptists were formed, and the reason why Southern is in the name, is because it was a break between Baptists in the North and Baptists in the South over the issue, specifically over the issue of slavery, with Southern Baptists asserting their right to enslave other people and on the basis of the color of their skin, and that this was perfectly compatible, defended this, right, in religious and theological terms. And then I was almost wholly ignorant of that story. And one I've been writing on some issues with Tulsa this week, and one story I'll share, that came out of that is the Sunday after the massacre. So, we got 300 African Americans, killed, estimated. Nobody really knows the full death toll, but upwards of 300 killed in a span of 2 days. The entire city burned, Greenwood area of the city burned to the ground. The following Sunday, kind of one of the tallest steeples in churches in there is a Methodist church that at the time was part of the Methodist Episcopal Church South, right? And again, that Southern South was the split within the Methodists, who actually split the same year the Baptists did, 1845, over the issue of slavery. What was notable is that a Methodist bishop had come up from Dallas to take the pulpit, because this was a public relations issue. And he took the pulpit from the local pastor so that he could control the story, and delivered a sermon that is appallingly racist, from this very prominent pulpit in Tulsa. He blamed the massacre on the African-American population, and basically said if whites had any responsibility, it was that they had not enforced the law enough ahead of the massacre to stamp out immorality in the African-American community. That was, in fact, the cause. But in his sermon, and went straight at the issue. He said, "I want to be very clear. There will never be racial equality. It is divinely ordained that there will never be
Wow.
racial equality. And that was the sermon, right? Preached to, this was the kind of civic church with the doctors and lawyers and all that went. And that was the official story. And it was legitimized, right, by a very prominent white Protestant minister. And this story happens over and over and over again, not just back in the 19th century, but well into the 20th century. And I think it was just, we just have to get our heads around, that history and account for it, and tell the truth about it.
Well, I think the truth is important. And I think that, a lot of times I hear well-meaning white Christians talk about how their church or our church was silent and stayed out of civil rights or stayed out of these issues. And I think what's so important about your book is saying that's not exactly true. They were very much involved, just not on the side that most of us would hope, which is a hard thing to grapple with, a hard thing to think about, a hard thing to take any kind of responsibility for, or a desire to change the future and how we are. And so as you've been telling these hard truths, you've been out for almost a year now doing lots of talks like this, going to churches and other organizations. Has anything surprised you about your reception or the response you've received to the book?
Yeah, I'll say I've been on the whole pleasantly surprised at the receptivity, and I really think it's because of the ground that has been plowed by the Black Lives Matter movement over the last year. I think had this book come out a year earlier, before the protests that we saw last summer across the country, I think it would not have gotten the reception. I think, but I think in this context that many white Christians were realizing, we don't know this history. We don't know kind of the truth even about our own churches, and have set out on these quests. I've probably done 60 or 70 events, mostly with white churches, some with African-American churches, and a handful of courageous churches that have done it together, a white church and an African-American church kind of coming together to have the conversation. There have been, I would say, a few disappointing times where, event has been booked and it's been canceled because of the backlash, just when the event is advertised. Including not just local churches, but in one case, even a bishop that invited a conversation for that district that then got canceled. So that backlash is still out there, and I think the wariness of it, and I think the other thing is that I see is there is a kind of backlash, and we've all, I think, seen it by now, but I think it comes under like this kind of straw man critical race theory thing, kind of raising up something called critical race theory, shooting it down, calling it incompatible with the gospel. These are kind of movements that I think are really defensive movements in the face. But that actually makes me a little bit hopeful, because we only have those kind of defensive movements when people perceive the wind a headwind, right? And they're kind of putting up the defenses.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought much about that, but people only go to that effort when you're hitting a nerve, perhaps. And so I think that's right. If there was one concept or insight that you've learned about racism and white supremacy that you wish more white churches would understand and face, what would that be?
I think it's just broadening our understanding of what white supremacy means. I think that's, again, I'm not preaching here. I mean, this is part of my own journey. I think before writing the book, I had a hard time connecting with white supremacy too. I would think about it, and I think many whites do, in a kind of defensive way, where it's a black and white photograph or a kind of grainy movie, that we picture are, something way back in the past and far away from us. I think one of the things, actually, a colleague of mine, Eddie Glaude, who's a professor of religion, African-American studies at Princeton, kind of has challenged us to kind of think about what he calls white supremacy without all the bluster, right? So if we get away from these extreme events of lynchings and and people in hoods and burning crosses, and we kind of, and one thing that helped me is just to flip the terms around and to think about, like, so what does it mean, not just white supremacy, but a society set up to ensure the supremacy of whites, right? If we
Hmm.
kind of ask about it that way, it becomes less some label that's back there. And then we start thinking about, well, how recently has it been, that where you could live, what job you could have, who you could date or marry, what kind of loans you could get from guaranteed by the government. All of these things were racially divided, right, in the country, and they were reserved for people who could claim to be white, and it really did ensure, a kind of leg up for anyone who could claim to be white, and that wasn't available to those who could not. And I think there's just no question when you ask that, like, has American society been set up right in a way that if you could claim to be white and get admitted to that category, that you had real concrete structural advantages, not just kind of conceptual or cultural advantages, but like jobs, schools, healthcare, loans, like all that, access to capital, all of that stuff was really restricted if you weren't, in this category of white, and all of that world was legitimized by white Christians, right? None of this happens, right, without the explicit kind of justification that, yep, that world is okay by us, by white Christian churches.
Well, because so many of those were public policy decisions. And, in a democracy where for so long white Christians had so much political influence, that's, it's just a direct line to those sort of policies. One thing you said, you keyed on a word that I want to go back to, and you said journey. It's been a journey for you. I've been on a journey. I think every white person that I know that has come to some sort of different understanding of race or racism, of white supremacy, has used that term journey. And so, I think that's a hard thing. You have to decide to go on that journey. It's not an easy journey. It's a painful journey, and you're never going to finish, by the way. And so I think I think your book helps give people another step in that journey. I know that's one of the reasons why, it's the first book for June for our new book club, that I think it relates so well to a lot of CBF, the folks who want to start that journey or who are new on that journey. If a pastor or a church were to read your book and feel compelled to respond in a tangible way, what are some of the things you feel that they should do? And I want to say too, to the example you give in the book, I'm proud that a CBF church is lifted up in your book, and I appreciate you lifting up First Baptist Church of Christ and Macon and Scott Dickinson and what they've been doing. That's an incredible example. But maybe even before a congregation gets there, what would you hope they might do after reading this book?
Yeah, well, there's no like chapter 8 that is like 10 steps, toward racial justice. And, I actually had some conversation with people about whether the book should have something like that at the end. But, at the end of the day, I don't think it can be kind of formulaic and kind of canned into a 10-step program. And part of the reason why I think that is because so much of this is local, right? And I think would be the challenge, is like, make it local. What is your community's history? What is your community's story? What is your family story? Like, and so like telling your own stories and telling your own truth, I think, is like the best place to begin. So, if every white Christian church in America, for example, asked, what's the story of how we came to be, even geographically, where we are, right? And answer that question rigorously, it's going to bring up things like white flight to the suburbs, right? If it's a newer church in an all-white suburb, it's going to bring up things like, even if you're in an older area of the city, what was that a whites only area of the city, and was the church part of a racially restricted neighborhood covenant? In the middle of the 20th century, when segregation was kind of officially outlawed, what role did it play, and what was its witness during the civil rights movement, if it existed? Then, and what were its policies? And here's the other thing, I think, for particularly churches that have been around a while, and did it bless political, civic, and cultural leaders who were avid segregationists, right? And how did it do that? and just asking, I think, those questions, and even going back, to saying, okay, and what land does it sit on? Like, how did it come to own this property? And if you trace the land back, where does it come from? And even kind of getting a sense of, beyond kind of white landholders and deeds, but like Native American lands, like where did it, how far back does it go? And if you really tell that story in an unflinching way, that opens up all kinds of possibilities, I think, for a better understanding of who we are. And I think that's really what's at stake. And, this is not, for me, right, if we think about like, the truth will set you free, this kind of aphorism from the New Testament, right? You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. I mean, there is something, I think, real about that in telling the truth about race in white communities, right? We are bound up in lies and myths about who we are and where we come from. And in that way, we don't really know who we are. And so I think there's not just kind of, an external need to kind of do right by those we've wronged. I mean, that is certainly there. But like, we have our own self-interest here, of kind of healing ourselves really from this disease that we've allowed to kind of dwell among us for so long.
That's really an important point, and it gets to one of the questions we had come in, and I think you touched on it. But it's the question was, what do you say to someone who says a church that says, well, this doesn't really matter anymore. That history doesn't matter anymore. We're at a different place now. We should just kind of look to the future and go forward. Would you add anything to that question?
Yeah, I'd say it's probably the most common defensive reaction from someone who's white and whose heart is in the right place and knows it's going to cost him something to go there, to really take that up. It's an avoidance strategy, straight up. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges, is that we have to be able to, I've used the term sit with, the discomfort, to sit with the awkwardness, to sit with the like shame and pain and embarrassment and all of that stuff, right? And we're not doing that just to kind of beat ourselves up, but I mean, we have to sit with that stuff to get to health. I think that's really it, and sit long enough with it, right? To come out on the other side in a different place. I would invite someone like that to say, look, let's just name that as a legitimate, understandable, but defensive reaction, right? And let's just acknowledge it and sit with it, and let's keep asking the questions, because I think that's one of the challenges. We're just going to have to peel back layers and layers and layers of defensiveness, really, to get to the root of the matter. But again, what we're after here is like freedom, right? At the end of the day, right? A freedom to know who we are, and freedom to be in right relationship with others, and we got both Old and New Testaments telling us, and putting the words in God's mouth, that like, look, don't come to the altar and worship me. If you got something wrong between you and your brother or your sister, go get that right first before you come offering prayers and worship to me. And I think that's really apt for where we are today.
Well, and I would add, that in both the Old and New Testament, history is important. Remembering is a theme. Remembering, and I think if we're not remembering correctly, that's problematic. We got another question to the kind of what additional work must the church do in dismantling white supremacy? And I read this as, okay, we've talked about the history and where we've been. We've got a few ideas on next steps, but what's the big picture work do you think that the church, particularly the white church, should be doing and has to do in order to dismantle white supremacy?
Yeah. Well, again, I'm kind of like disown my 10-step program. I don't have one, and I don't think I should have one.
We didn't advertise one, so you're all right. It's not an easy one.
But what I would say is that, like, there's internal work. I've kind of boiled this down sometimes into telling the truth and loving our neighbors, right? That really, that's what this is about. Those two things. I think sometimes we get all twisted up, and because it feels overwhelming, right? And in some ways it is. It's 400 years of history here in this country that we're talking about undoing, right? And talking about trying to see differently. So that's a big, daunting task. But on the other hand, it really is about telling the truth as best as we can and loving our neighbors as best as we can, and That second piece, I would say, is part of it, is trying to figure out, because this is one of the biggest problems, that I experienced growing up. Certainly, we have to figure out how to be in community with our African American brothers and sisters. We have to figure that out. In many ways, there's no way to fully go on this journey without being in relationship with Black and brown people. And I think that's part of the antidote, and part of really accountability, and keeping it real. I think there's legitimate time for white people to sort of do white people's work in white people's spaces. I think that's right, and in Christian spaces, that's really important. But I think there is a kind of rhythm to it. There has to also be connections and real relationships built, and that takes, again, that's not a quick fix. I mean, that's something that's going to take a lot of time. It's going to be organic. It's going to be bumpy, and it's going to, have to work through some mistrust that's been built up particularly between white and Black, Christians living in the same community. I mean, whites suddenly showing up and saying we want to be in a relationship isn't always going to be met immediately with trust, and thinking that that's authentic given the history. But I do think finding some ways to really be in relationship is one of the ways to really change.
Well, I wholeheartedly agree. I think there are a lot of steps in this journey. I think your book does a great job of talking about some of the history that's necessary to learn. I agree, people ought to look local. We have to do some reevaluation of theology, and those relationships are certainly very, very important. I want to ask you one last question, let you give a chance to give a little preview maybe of some of the work that PRRI is doing. Is there a study or anything coming out recently or soon that you'd like folks to be aware of?
Yeah, so most of the public opinion work that I have in the book is from a 2018 study. I should let everybody know we did some follow up in 2020 as part of our American Values Survey. We're going to be doing that again in 2021 this fall. So stay tuned for that. It's going to be we'll revisit many of those questions to see really how things have shifted over time. Particularly since George Floyd's death and the protests for racial justice across the summer. What we did see is really a movement among everyone except white evangelicals, unfortunately, from 2015 to 2018, really in the early phases of the Black Lives Matter movement, and not a lot of movement over the last year. But white evangelicals have really not budged. I think the work is still very much needed in the evangelical white evangelical community.
Well, thank you. I encourage folks to go to your website and look at those reports as they informs them on this journey and churches on this journey. Robert Jones, thank you so much for your time tonight, for writing this book, for your generosity with CBF. And I also want to tell folks there's a written interview coming out in Fellowship Magazine. So Robert, thank you as well for doing that written interview with me. That'll be published soon. We wish you many blessings on your unique and very important ministry you have right now.
Thanks, Stephen. Really glad to be with you.
Well, thank you all for joining us here tonight. We hope you will join us in reading White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in Christian America, the June selection for CBF's new book club. You can go on and see the discussion guide available at cbf.net/books. There it is right there. Well, again, on Thursday night, June 24th at 7 Eastern, we'll have another discussion time to talk about the book and maybe what you've read up to that point. It's free to attend that discussion, but we need you to register at cbf.net/books. I invite you to join us again in 2 weeks for the next CBF gathering. Thank you all for your attention tonight. Thank you again to Robert P. Jones for being with us, and we hope you all have a wonderful week. Take care.